I haven't been talking with myself lately. I've been too busy. I've been too busy to go to beautiful places and talk with myself. I've been too busy to breathe deeply. I've been too distracted to think about making the most of every moment of my day. I've been a little too distracted. And the things that I find myself, the things that I find my hands full of is work, labor, looking for more work, drinking, smoking weed, and entertainment. These are the things that I find occupying my time, and it's none of these things have anything to do, or they have very little to do with the eternal, with persisting through time perfectly. You set foot into nature, and all that you're surrounded by is what persists through time perfectly. Very recently, at least at work, I've been finding this man, Jared Diamond, very enjoyable to listen to, and his perspective, or at least his general perspective. He wants to look at why civilizations have existed and dominate other civilizations. And I'm, summarizing it in a strange way to characterize his work. He wants to look at why some technologies are developed, and he wants to understand the history of humanity on this planet. And through understanding its history, he can see where it's going. And one phrase that he brings up, it's like when you look at the collapse of ancient civilizations, of old civilizations, they're cutting down the last palm tree on the island. The desertification of the Middle East thousands of years ago. When didn't they see what was happening? Didn't they see what they were doing? Why didn't they stop themselves in time? Didn't they have the ability to see, oh, we're cutting down the last tree? And he makes a funny statement that in 50 years' time, in 100 years' time, they will have the exact same thing to say about us and our lack of awareness, and how shocking it is knowing that what we know now, our inability to collectively do something meaningful in response to what actually threatens us. And it is not one thing or another thing. Reducing it to this is almost guaranteeing our destruction. And there's something very interesting, very cool interview. It's a conversation between Harari, Yuval, and Jared Diamond, which is and they had a wonderful conversation. By the way, Harari is quite inspired by Jared and his works, and Steel, Germs, and Guns, I guess, was he quotes that book as being one of his inspirations during school. That, you can make work that is not necessarily entertaining, that is not populist, I guess. That's an inappropriate way to use that word. But you can make work that is meaningful on subjects that were considered boring. That you can make work, you can make popular work. And I think they begin to talk about something that is extremely interesting. But I'm jumping I'm jumping again before I get to that thought. I'm jumping again because, you look at where civilizations have been able to flourish, where, civilizations have been able to develop technology, and you see agriculture. You see agriculture for one, and you see the ability to more efficiently provide food without the requirement for every single person to be the providers of food. And then you see specialization. You see the specialization in each other's time to do more skilled, more complicated tasks, to develop technologies. And a part of these technologies, or what played a massive role in the development of technologies, is finding ways not just to be more efficient agriculturally, but to be more efficient in terms of energy overall, and the use of energy, the application of energy. And what better application of energy in a time without technology than the use of animals, the use of the energy of animals, and directing their energy, and raising cattle and directing their energy to apply to our tasks of not only agriculture but other work, other transportation of goods and materials, and even the maneuvering of building materials. But I speak vaguely. I'm sounding so vague now. But it seems that not every place in the world was as geographically lucky to have an animal that was easily domesticated. And you see where animals were easily domesticated, the flourishing of not only humanity but technology. And thus begins this foot race of development. And I think there's something extremely interesting about the development that we are increasing our leverage. We are continuing to increase our leverage, and you see the exact same thing happening currently with AI. That the groups of people able to make the most out of AI, they will have the biggest lever. They will have the biggest lever on this planet in terms of leveraging their energy to do more, to figure out more, to accomplish more. They will be more productive. And it's such a funny concept, to come back to the animals. And because I think I'm skipping a step. I think I'm definitely skipping a step, and there's the domestication of plants. Then there was the domestication of animals. And now there's the domestication of computers, of computer intelligence. To think it's not already domesticated. But it is the fine-tuning to our applications. But we have skipped a step, and this is the step that I am most interested in, and this is the domestication of man. And they seem to touch on this topic in that interview a little bit, but not to the degree that I think it is worthy of exploring, maybe. That the domestication of man, the domination of man for other men's purposes, this has been the bulk of our modern history after the domestication of plants and then the domestication of animals. It was then the domestication of man, and I think you will see in today's age that it is nearly perfected. The domination of entire peoples by small groups of people. The way the herding cattle has been, for the most part perfected by the rancher. And how many hands do you need to corral 1,000 cows? These massive creatures that individually have the power to crush you. Somehow they are corralled by a handful of people quite comfortably Maybe not comfortably, but manageably. I don't know the comforts of the life of ranching. This is incredibly interesting. And the techniques used to dominate, to domesticate man, to subdue. And we see them in some forms, and I will not speak perfectly now because this is something I'm, not well researched in. I do not have an encyclopedic knowledge of human history, but I have a budding interest. I have a budding interest in it. And you look at these uncontacted groups of people, the so-called primitive people. Jared likes to use the word traditional. They live traditional lives in comparison to the Western life. They live traditionally, as human beings traditionally lived. You see, what do you see? You see contact, and you see the slavery. And this is the obvious and clearest form of the domestication of man, the domination of man, is slavery. And there's very plain examples, and where man could not be conquered, where they could not be enslaved, where they could not be assimilated to the purposes of the conqueror, you see they're eradicated. They're eradicated like wolves are eradicated when you need to protect your cattle in a vicinity. They're eradicated like wolves. They are too wild. They are dangerous. They must be assimilated or destroyed. When you look at the history of nations, this is riddled throughout all history. The history of all nations. And this is a blanket statement, but much of the history, I look at Canada. Canada's history is entirely involved in the eradication of the native and the indigenous people that lived here. It is dependent on their eradication. The creation of America is dependent on the eradication. You see the Spain conquering what is now known as South America. The conquering of South America required the domination, the domestication of the population there, or their eradication. And you see the same thing happening throughout Africa, and it extended even into not this century, we're in the 2000s. It extended into the last century, late into the last century. It was only after World War II, and many of these European powers lacked the manpower and capacity to maintain dominance and control over these regions, that you find African countries finally gaining their independence in comparison to many other countries around the world. And even in this independence, there are neo-colonial forms of domination. There are neo-colonial forms of guaranteeing the energy of an entire people is being put forth to your ends and not theirs. And this continues to happen. And this continues to happen throughout Africa, throughout many countries within Africa. And I do not know well enough the history of Asia to speak clearly about it. But I actually have no doubt that you'll find a similar history. You'll find a history of conquering and dominating peoples and forcing them to produce with their energy, be productive to another's ends. And you see this in India, the conquering of India by England. And you see this also in China and whatever the the tea wars, and the forcing of the opening of the trade with China, and the threat of destruction if they did not trade. And this is obviously to the benefit of the external nations and to the detriment of China. But you can say that trade is overall in the long term a benefit to all. I think you will find in in the specifics of neo-colonial techniques that trade is not to the benefit of all. And this is an area of research that, that would be extremely important in understanding the current domestication of man. It's extremely interesting. But to return to the Harari and Jared interview, they brought up a point that, there are still teachers today in America that don't believe in evolution. And it's not that the general public doesn't believe in evolution, or it's not that, the general public in Brazil thinks the planet is flat. That is so terrifying. It is terrifying that the source of communicating to people that are interested in the truth, the sources of this information don't believe this. That teachers don't believe this. This is what is terrifying. This is what is terrifying. And that's incredibly interesting. The most significant way of domestication, and this is not a point that they made, this is a point that I'm making. The most significant form of domestication must come through communication. It must come through communication. And because, Harari makes a wonderful point that in a dictatorship, say they want to make nuclear weapons, they need to understand the truth. They need the truth in order to deal with reality, in order to produce something that can have a great effect on reality, such as a nuclear weapon. They need the truth. It is more important. It is extremely fundamental that they have the perfect understanding of reality, or a very good understanding of physics in order to build something like this. And it's not just an understanding of physics, and it's not just a few physicists that you need. You need, in partnership, thousands and thousands, millions of miners and mining companies. You need agricultural workers to be working in unison to provide food for all of these other workers. You need many other researchers dedicated to educating and training people to even be able to solve this problem. And you need laborers and builders just to create the facilities to construct these things. And you need manufacturers to build certain other parts, and chemical engineers. You need all of these different workers. You need millions of people actually to cooperate together to build something that is as sophisticated as a nuclear weapon. But there is no conceivable way to communicate to 2 million people that E equals MC squared. And this is why you need to do this with the farmland, and this is why you need to mine this material, and this and this and this. There is no way to communicate that this is the most important thing that we all need to be focusing on. And I mean, the logic I'm saying is a little inaccurate, because maybe the agricultural worker does not need an incentive besides needing to feed themselves, needing to pay for their own goods. Besides that, in order to be incentivized to farm, they didn't, and the miner needs not be concerned with E equals MC squared in order to dig uranium out of the ground and transport it and discover a way to transport it, if there are people interested in paying for such a task to be done. And I'm almost defeating my own point, but I think the point that I was making that I poorly communicated, that Harari, I think, made in a much more concise and clear way than I just did, is that is that it is hard to communicate a perfect understanding. It is very difficult to communicate a perfect understanding. So, what you find in order to, at least, and a better example is actually convincing people to participate in one nation, convincing people that under one group of people's monopoly of violence, that they should see themselves as this sort of family, as this sort of group. What is it? The tribes in Papua New Guinea, I think they must have been convinced by PNG to see themselves as Papua New Guineans, because otherwise they see themselves as, I am of this clan, and I am of this land, and I'm of this hillside, and I'm of these waters, and I'm of this mountain, and I'm of this great group, and this is how they understand themselves. They do not understand themselves as an invisible line on a map. This you have to convince. This you have to communicate in order to, convince people to go to war as a nation, as a single identity, a large group of people to work together to fight against a foreign power, to fight against an external. They must see themselves all as internal somehow. But this is very unnatural, I think, at least when you look at the traditional societies. This is an unnatural thing to do. You actually find more division on much smaller scales. To see such a large group of people unanimously consider themselves Canadian or American or German or Vietnamese is not necessarily an automatic thing to do. This is where you find another technique, another extremely significant technique in the domestication of people, and garnering or making their energy go towards your own causes and not necessarily theirs, is that you need to find a way to communicate a narrative. You need to find a way to communicate powerful narratives to large groups of people that they will accept. And complicated truths are difficult to communicate, but large, sweeping stories, emotional stories, stories with heroes, stories with villains, stories with that encourage us to identify emotionally with an entity that has nothing to do with us individually. You will see an incredible effort is made, because this is a tool of domestication, and it's the exact same effort that the rancher puts into making the fence around the cattle, because the cattle, the only reason we need fences around cattle is because they don't understand stories very well. Because if we can convince them of stories, we wouldn't need to build such, well-made fences for them. The ideas would fence them in. And I think the ideas that are fencing people in currently, globally, is the idea that, if that country is doing poorly, that doesn't mean my country is. If there are people dying on that side of this wall, that doesn't mean we're doing poorly. That has nothing to do with us. That's a separate place. The same way, when you're in your home, and this is something maybe much more relatable, that what happened on the other side of that wall, that whole family could be starving to death. That don't mean you're starving. But I swear to you it does. And James Baldwin makes a perfectly clear point when he says, we need to understand that when, when the people in Africa are starving, that does not mean we are safe. It's the exact opposite. It means we are next. That's what that means. And and it's the tools of domestication. That tool of nationality that is used to confine a people within a border, within a monopoly of violence, that encourages people to work, and then give their money to this said holder of the monopoly of violence, the government, taxes, to be taxed, and to drive all of their effort and energy into few hands. It is this exact tool of domestication of men that is actually a part of our own destruction. And Carl Sagan actually makes a very good point, perfectly good point, when he says, emissions don't understand borders. They have no concept of them. They cross them freely. They don't know what passports are. One country's problem in this regard is every country's problem. We do not need to speak of countries. We need to speak of the earth. We need to speak of a collective understanding, a global understanding. And to me, this is one way to disintegrate this very powerful tool that has been used to domesticate men to their own detriment, that we need to gain not a national identity, but an earthen identity. We do not need to sympathize with the national psychology. We need to sympathize with the earthen psychology. And when you look at, persisting through time, you will see that if the right hand sought to do for itself, regardless of what the left hand needed, which is highly impossible, to be fair. But if the right hand saw to wash itself, and only itself, and not the left, and not your foot, and the other parts of the body rotted away, how then could the right hand go on to survive for a very long time after, if the rest of the body is destroyed? This is the nature of living on this planet. We require each other. We require the entire earth to exist. Just as, this tree has required the entire history of the geology of the earth to come to be. We require the earth to exist. And it is not just because of our trade, not just because of our trade routes and dependence of passing territories and flying over this area and that area. It is a much deeper truth that we require the entire earth to exist. And by excluding ourselves from understanding that we are all a part of the earth, we run the risk of destroying our parts of our whole. We don't just run the risk, we continue to do it. Look at the conflicts that are raging all over the planet. It's because of the ability for us to separate ourselves from the other. And I do not recommend that there is a one government to guarantee this earthen psychology. I actually feel like that would be to the detriment. And I think it is also this centralization, and this may sound contradictory, I do feel like it is decentralization of peoples and their powers and their efforts that allows many advancements to be made, but it also allows much of the domination we see on this planet. It allows this, it encourages it. For a small group of people to decide that it is worthwhile to destroy another group of people on another side of the wall, it requires a domesticated population. It requires a subdued population. It requires a population that has been convinced of a simple narrative that has nothing to do with reality. It requires it. And it is not to their benefit that anyone goes to war. It is not to the benefit of any family that bombs are dropped on anyone's home. It is not to anyone's benefit that that family over there is starving. And if there is a benefit, I swear to you, it is short-lived. And it is this exact mentality, this short-term mentality, that sees the destruction of our livelihoods as well. That sees the destruction of people. Our inability to think eternally. And that is too broad, but to think on a much longer scale. Oh, it's like this idea of not being concerned about the planet because you won't be around to see the bad side effects of the way we treat it. This is retarded. What understanding, as if there is a border between us and our children. Now, and this is not nationality, this is a new or a separate tool of misunderstanding, of separation, that somehow our future generations have nothing to do with us. So I'm very interested in understanding the tools of domestication of man. I'm extremely interested in exploring this topic and coming to which is a dangerous word to say, coming to a conclusion. And I believe if you're listening to this, if you are interested in making any sort of change in the world, I swear to you, you must be interested in a longer timeline than those that changed the world into what it is now. We must be interested in longer and longer timelines of existence if we are to persist on this planet, to persist in the universe. And to whose benefit? To all. To all's benefit. We must be interested in what we would do forever, and not just in what is good to do now. What is good to do now is being invested in eternity. That is what is good to do now. That will always be good. That will be good to do tomorrow. That'll be good to do next week, next year, in 20 years. When you're dead, it'll be good for your kids to be interested in it. If there's anything important that the human project is to do, it will involve being interested in eternity and persisting through time. This is more important than any of the things that we are immediately fascinated by, even though, however powerful and wonderful religion has been informing what we call progress, and nations have been informing what we call progress, and any other dogmas have been informing what we call progress. If they cannot persist through time without destroying us or destroying the things that we need to exist, I swear to you, you must give them up. Collectively, we must give them up. We must move into a way of living that can continue. If there is such a thing for humans to do in the universe. If there is anything for humans to do in the universe at any time, we must find a way to persist.